My name is Amir. I am 29 years old and I fled from Syria to Germany. When I think about it now, I still can't quite grasp what happened in the last few years of my life. But it is my story and I want to tell it. Maybe it will help someone who is just as lost as I was back then. That I grew up in Syria, in a typical Muslim family, in a country that was becoming increasingly distant from what I had dreamed of as a child. The faith we lived in our family was strict. We prayed, fasted, and tried to live by the rules we were taught. I had never thought much about whether this was really the right thing for me. It was just what you did. It was part of us, it was part of our identity, but as I got older, I realized that the beliefs I had weren't really fulfilling me. It was like I was constantly clinging to rules and regulations, but I felt more and more empty. That's when I started asking, why? Why do we believe this? Why is it always just about rules and obligations? I never asked those questions out loud because it wasn't the right time. And I knew that if I started, it would alienate me from my family and my community. And then the war began. It's hard to talk about it because it changed so many things in my life that I hardly know where to begin. The war took everything from me, my family, my friends, my home. The bombs were falling every day and there was nothing I could do but run away. I couldn't understand it. How could God allow this to happen? How could the faith that was always sold to me as protection and the answer to everything now let me down like this? I remember the day I lost my family. It was a normal afternoon, or at least it was supposed to be. I was at home when the sirens blared. Panic broke out, people ran, and then that deafening bang. When the dust settled, all I saw was rubble. I had lost my family. They were all gone. At that point, I knew that the faith that had been with me all my life had not saved me. Nothing had saved me. I fled the country. I fled to Germany. And when I arrived here, I didn't feel like someone who was saved. I felt like a loser, a refugee, a nobody. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to hold on to the faith that I had known for so many years. In Syria, Islam was everything to us. But here, in a country that had in some ways welcomed me, I asked myself why I should continue to hold on to the faith. If Islam was so right, why hadn't it saved me from misfortune? Why hadn't it protected me from war, loss, and pain? It was that moment when I really questioned for the first time what I had been taught all my life. And the more I tried to find answers, the more I realized I wasn't finding answers. All I was left with was an emptiness. I arrived in Germany, tried to adjust, tried to start a new life, but the feeling of emptiness remained. The pain of my past, the loss of my family, the war, all of that was still there. I just couldn't shake it off. It was like I had lost a part of myself that I could never find again. The days went by and I tried to find my way. I learned German, found accommodation, and got a job. But every time I was alone, I was overcome by this question. What is the point of all this? Why am I even here? It was as if I was looking for something, but I didn't know what I was looking for. I tried to distract myself with work, with the new people I met, but it didn't help. Something was missing and I couldn't put my finger on it. It was then, as I was standing on a street corner in Berlin, that I saw this small church. It wasn't the first time I had seen it, but that day I suddenly felt the urge to go inside. I didn't know why, but something inside me just wanted to do it. I went inside, not knowing what to expect. It was quiet when I entered the church. The atmosphere was calm, peaceful. I sat down on one of the pews and looked around. I felt a little out of place, but at the same time I also felt a strange calm that I had never experienced in all the time I had been in Germany. I looked at the candles burning, at the cross on the wall. Something inside me said, "You are in the right place." And for a moment I no longer felt lost. I didn't know what it was. But it was the first moment in a long time where I didn't feel like everything was just an endless search. I just sat there looking at the cross, and suddenly a feeling of peace came over me. I couldn't explain what it was, but it felt like someone was in that room with me. That day I knew I was no longer the same Amir who had survived the war years ago. Something had changed, but I didn't yet know what it was. The days following my visit to the church were strange. It wasn't that I suddenly understood everything, but I felt like I had touched something that I couldn't quite grasp. I knew I was at a point where something inside me needed to change, but I didn't know how to initiate that change. I was in a new country, surrounded by a new culture, a new language, and everything I knew seemed somehow meaningless. The answers I was looking for were still not clear. That I went back to work, continued learning the language, tried to start a new life. But every time I was alone in the evening, the feeling of emptiness returned. The pain, the memories of my family, the questions the war had left in me. All of that was still there, and there was nothing that could really comfort me. I still felt like there had to be more, but I couldn't find it. Did I remember one of those nights? I sat on my bed and just stared out the window. The city lights glittered in the distance, but I felt completely alone. I thought about my family, my parents, my siblings, and wondered why all this had to happen. Why did I have to lose everything? I kept asking myself. Why didn't faith save me from all this pain? And then, on one of those quiet nights, I remembered the cross in the church. It was the only image I could see clearly from that moment. This strange calm that came over me as I sat there, doing nothing but just being. I knew I had to go back there, but I was afraid that it would only confuse me further. I had never really thought about Jesus, never really understood what he was all about. But there was something inside me that drove me to learn more about him. So I went back to the church. But this time I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I didn't want to just follow the religion my family had forced on me. I wanted to find the truth, not something that would just pull me further into the faith without me understanding it. The church was quiet again. This time I was alone. I sat down, closed my eyes, and tried to think. It was that day that I came across a flyer that talked about a Bible study group that was taking place nearby. It was a group of people who met regularly to pray and talk about life together. I had no idea what to expect there, but I knew I had to give it a try. So I signed up. The first night was strange. I can still remember walking into the small room where the group was gathering. I felt completely out of place, like I didn't belong. The people were friendly, but I wasn't sure what to say. Everyone talked about their faith, and I just sat there and listened. I couldn't really connect with them. They talked about love, about Jesus, about hope, but it was so different from anything I knew. It was like they were speaking a language I didn't understand. Then, toward the end of the meeting, one of the men asked me if I wanted to say something. I hesitated, but then I simply said, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I've lost everything that meant anything to me. My faith doesn't help me anymore. I don't know what to believe." The man who asked me simply smiled and said, "You don't have to know everything, Amir. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And he is waiting for you to meet him." I didn't know what that meant exactly, but something inside me sensed that it was more than just words. In that moment, I no longer felt like the stranger I was before. There was something that suddenly opened up inside me, something I had never felt before. It was a small step, but it was the first step in a direction I had never expected. Over the next few weeks, I went to meetings regularly. Sometimes it was hard to keep up, but every time I went, I felt a small change in myself. I began to listen to the stories from the Bible and think about them. Jesus, his words, his love, all of this was so different from what I knew from my family and my religion. But in the midst of these differences, I felt something that went through my soul. It was like a light flickering in the darkness. I remember one of the last meetings when someone read the verse from John 14 verse 6. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." These words hit me like a blow. I didn't understand them right away, but they stuck with me. What does that mean? What does it mean that Jesus is the way? I didn't know how to answer that question, but I knew I needed an answer. I started praying more, but not in the way I had prayed as a Muslim. It was more of a conversation, just talking to God, like a friend. I asked for guidance. I asked for peace. I asked to know the truth, and one night, when I was alone in my apartment again, I felt something. It was an inner peace that I had never felt before. Something told me, "You are no longer lost." I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I had found the right path. I felt that this Jesus that everyone was talking about really had something to give me. Something that Islam could never give me. Something that couldn't be rules or regulations. It was an evening I will never forget. In the weeks following my first meeting with the Bible study group, something had changed in me. I no longer felt like the same Amir who had fled Syria a few months ago, with all the pain and anger inside him. But at the same time, I knew that I had not yet reached my goal. The questions were still there inside me, and although I was getting closer to Jesus, I had not yet really understood what he could mean to me that I was in the church again that evening, alone. The atmosphere was different than the first time. It was quieter, more peaceful. There was a kind of familiarity that I couldn't quite place at the time. I sat back down on the pew and closed my eyes. This time it wasn't panic that overcame me, but a quiet anticipation. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I felt like everything was coming together in that moment. Suddenly I felt something I had never felt before in my life. Presence. It was not overwhelming, but rather calming and overwhelming at the same time. It was as if someone was sitting next to me, as if Jesus himself was speaking to me without saying a single word. I couldn't hear a voice, but I felt that he was there near me, right next to me. And something inside me knew, it is enough. You are enough. I could hardly organize my thoughts. Everything I had believed up to that point seemed to collapse in that moment. The questions I had been asking myself for years, the anger that was inside me, the despair I had experienced from losing my family, all of that suddenly seemed to take on meaning. It was as if the darkness that had accompanied me for so long was broken by a light that not only illuminated my soul, but also brought me peace that I never thought possible. That I remember reaching for the Bible that was on the bench in front of me with shaking hands. I happened to turn to a verse and my eyes fell on these words. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I knew in that moment that those words were not just an invitation. They were a promise. And that promise was for me. It was the first time I really understood those words. I no longer felt like an outsider searching for something. I was invited to be a part of something bigger, something that would not judge me, but would accept me in all my imperfections. It was not the faith I had learned in childhood. It was not heavy and full of rules, but light and full of grace. That I left the church that evening in a kind of trance. My mind was racing, but at the same time there was this peace that accompanied me. Something inside me knew that I had just made a decision that would change my life. I had no idea how this decision would affect my everyday life, but I knew that I really wanted to follow Jesus now. I had found him, and he had found me. The next few days were like a rush. I didn't tell anyone about this experience because I knew no one would understand, but an unstoppable desire to learn more about Jesus grew within me. I began to read the Bible more, looking for answers to questions I had never dared to ask. I found comfort in the stories of Jesus, but also a challenge. What he did, what he said, it was different from anything I had known. But that was exactly what I needed. I continued to meet with the Bible study group, but I couldn't wait to learn more, to understand more. I wanted to understand the truth of Jesus not just with my head, but with my whole heart. And the more I read, the more I knew that he was the way, the only way that could bring me peace. At that point, I had made the decision to follow Jesus. But it wasn't the easy decision you hear in stories. It was the decision to leave all that behind me, the doubts, the fears, the insecurities. It was the decision to question my belief in Islam and to try something new. But deep down, I knew it was the right step. That I remember sitting alone in my apartment one evening when suddenly, for a moment, everything became clear. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to find my own strength, to seek my own answers. But in that moment, I knew it wasn't my strength that would save me. It was the grace of Jesus embracing me and giving me the peace I had been seeking for so long. I didn't have all the answers, but I had Jesus. And that was enough. It wasn't easy. I thought that after experiencing that moment of clarity in church, I would understand everything. But the reality was much more complex. The peace I had felt was there, but the more I engaged with Jesus, the more I realized that it was a decision that turned everything I had thought upside down. I remember sitting in front of the Bible one evening and asking myself, am I really ready to take this path? I was still the same Amir who had fled Syria with all that pain. I had all those wounds inside me, all those questions that were still unanswered. And yet I knew there was no turning back. If I really wanted to follow Jesus, I had to let go of everything that tied me to the past. I could no longer simply live in two worlds, one that continued to rely on Islam and one that drew me to Jesus. It was time to make a choice. It was one of those nights when I was sitting in my small apartment and thinking about everything. I had prayed so many times before, but this time it was different. It wasn't a prayer full of words. It was just a quiet, honest conversation with God. I don't know what's coming, but I know that I can't go on alone anymore. I know that I need you. You have shown me what true love and forgiveness means, and I want to accept that love. It wasn't a big ceremony. It wasn't an instant revelation. It was simply a decision that hit me deep inside. I wanted to follow Jesus with all my fears and insecurities. But I also knew that this wouldn't be easy. I was aware of the consequences. In my family and my community, this decision would not be well received. But I felt that I had no other choice. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. I continued to attend Bible study meetings, but now I no longer felt like an outsider. I was a part of something. Understanding Jesus' message was more than just knowledge. It was a change inside me. It wasn't just hearing stories, it was living what he taught. And as I delved deeper into studying the Bible, I began to understand more and more what it meant to follow in Jesus' footsteps. I remember the first time I really got into the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? It wasn't just about accepting a religion or a belief system. It was about seeing the world through different eyes. The love that Jesus preached wasn't something you just understood. It was something you had to experience. A love that goes beyond pain, beyond hate, beyond what divides us. A love that accepts even the enemy and forgives the neighbor. At that point, I knew I had to move toward baptism. It was a step that took me even deeper into life with Jesus. But it was also a step that freed me from my past and all the ties that bound me to the old faith. I knew that this step was not just external, it was an internal break. I wanted to leave behind the person who had never really understood what true forgiveness and true love meant. I found a new freedom in baptism. When I was submerged and resurfaced, I felt like my life had a new beginning. It was as if all the burdens I had carried were falling away from me. I was no longer the man who had experienced the war in Syria, who had suffered the loss of his family. I was no longer the man who felt lost in a foreign land. I was a new man in Christ. And that was true freedom. It was the moment of baptism that shaped my life in a completely new way. But what came after was not the liberating closure I had expected. The reality that I had separated myself from everything that had ever been familiar to me slowly sank in. In the days and weeks after baptism, I did not immediately feel like a new person. I felt as if I was living two lives, the new life in Christ and the old life that still connected me to the past. But I knew that the step I had taken was irreversible. The true cost of this decision began to show when I told my family about my baptism. My father reacted as I expected, with disappointment, anger, and total rejection. "What have you done, Amir? You betrayed us and everything we taught you. How could you? You have let your family down. You have severed your roots." His face was twisted. The anger in his eyes was obvious. It was as if he physically felt the pain of my decision. The words he spoke hurt more than I ever expected. In that moment, I didn't feel like the son he knew, but like a stranger who suddenly appeared in his life. I could see his disappointment, but at the same time I knew that I could no longer follow the same path. Not in the same way. "Why did you do that?" he asked me. But I couldn't find an answer that would satisfy him. It wasn't that I didn't want to explain to him why I was taking this step. It was because he would never really understand what it meant for me to find Jesus. The pain I experienced from my family was deep. But the inner conflicts also began to torment me. I kept asking myself whether I was doing the right thing. Had I really left everything behind? Wasn't there another way to live my faith without betraying my origins? Doubts kept creeping into my heart. What if you're wrong? I asked myself in quiet moments. What if you're telling yourself something? And then there were the others, the refugees I kept meeting. Many of them shared the same faith that I had before, and they quickly noticed that something had changed in me. They asked me why I had left Islam behind, why I had chosen the Christian path. Their looks were doubtful. Sometimes I felt a sense of rejection. It was as if they thought I had become weak or was giving up something that had made me strong. In their eyes, Islam was not just a religion, but a protection that would protect me from the outside world. But what bothered me even more was the moment when I was confronted with my own thoughts and doubts. I had never really thought about how deeply rooted the change of faith was in me. I had always been looking for answers, but never really felt that I had a real connection to God. The Islam I had known had not given me a sense of security, but rather a sense of duty, and the strict rules that had to be followed had never brought me a sense of peace. But the decision to become a Christian brought up all those old doubts in me, and I couldn't just brush them away. That I began to feel increasingly isolated. The people around me didn't understand what was going on inside me, and I couldn't explain to them what Jesus had meant to me. And at the same time, I knew that I could no longer hide behind the rules. I had to take responsibility for my faith, and that meant not only facing up to others, but above all to myself. That I in all this doubt and pain, however, I also found comfort in the words of the Bible. One verse in particular stuck with me. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I began to think about what these words really meant to me. Jesus was speaking of a relief I had never experienced, a freedom that comes not through laws and rules, but through accepting His grace. It was this thought that always brought me back on the right path. Yes, I had experienced rejection from my family. Yes, I had felt the looks and silence of the people around me. But deep down I knew that I was no longer the same person. The path I had taken with Jesus was not the easiest, but it was the one that led me to myself. I had not only left my past behind me, but also all the burdens I had carried in my heart. And those moments of doubt, I always returned to the fundamental truths that Jesus had taught me. It's not about perfection. It's not about following rules. It's about love and forgiveness. And even though the road was rocky and I kept getting lost, I knew that Jesus was always with me. His love was greater than anything that bound me to my past. It was a long road that had brought me here. I had lost everything. My family, my home, my faith, and everything that had ever been familiar to me. The pain that had accompanied me all those years had not simply disappeared, but it had changed. I had found an answer in Jesus that I had never expected. An answer that gave me more than all those years of doubt and searching. I remember the day when I felt like everything inside and around me suddenly came into alignment. It wasn't the moment when I had all my questions answered, but it was the moment when I felt the truth. This truth was not a theory, not a religion, not a philosophy. It was alive. It was Jesus. And that day I knew I could leave everything I had been before behind me. I had always wondered why it was so hard to find peace. Why was life so complicated? Why could I never really find the comfort I needed? But now, in that moment, I knew that the peace I had been looking for was not in external circumstances. It was not in the world around me, not in my country, not in my family. The peace was within me, because Jesus was within me. I remember the first time I really went into fellowship with other Christians. I always felt like I was living in a foreign world, that I didn't really belong. But here, in the church, I felt truly at home for the first time. It was as if Jesus was drawing me even closer to Himself through these people, through this fellowship. We prayed together, laughed, cried, and I knew I was in a place where I was accepted, not for what I did, but for who I was. A beloved child of God. It was the freedom I never thought possible. A freedom that does not depend on external conditions, but on the relationship with Jesus. I did not have control over the world around me, but I did have control over my inner life, and that gave me a peace I had never known before. I could let go of my past and live with the peace that only the love of God could give me, but it wasn't always easy. In the first months of living with my new faith, there were many moments of doubt. I thought about my family, my mother who would never see me again, my father who had turned away from me. I wondered if I had taken the right path. But whenever I had those doubts, I remembered the moment I met Jesus, the love I had found in His name. I knew that love was real. I knew that Jesus would never abandon me, no matter what was happening around me. It was one of those evenings, sitting alone in my apartment once again, that I felt like everything was falling into place inside me. I didn't have all the answers, but I had Jesus, and that was enough. I knew that He had led me down the path that led to true freedom and peace. I knew that I was no longer searching because I had found what I had been looking for all along. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It wasn't a sign from heaven. It was simply a deep knowing, an inner feeling that I was now truly home. The path I had taken was the right one. I had found the love that had made me whole again, and it had always been there, right in front of me. It was just a matter of choosing to accept that love. Today, when I look back on my life, I see a completely different person. I am no longer the man who was on the run, who was full of doubt and anger. I am no longer the man who defined himself by rules and obligations, but the man who found himself through grace and love for Jesus. And this change, this new identity, is not just an external change. It has changed me from the inside out. That I am now a Christian, and for me that means that I do not just believe in a doctrine, but in a person. This person touched me, transformed me, and gave me a meaning in life. I have found the peace I have always sought and the freedom that nothing and no one can take away from me. It has been a long and often painful road, but now, at the end of this road, I can say that I have found more than I ever dreamed of. Freedom in Christ is freedom to truly live without fear, without doubt, without pain that defines me. I am a new person, and that is true peace.